Oh my god, this story is just dandy. Putin says Russia has sufficient cluster munitions and may retaliate if Ukraine uses them. So, for those of you who don't know or haven't been following the war in Ukraine very closely recently, United States recently approved some cluster munitions to be sent to Ukraine. I think it was in total like 100,000 cluster munitions, as in not like individual bomblets, but 100,000 like artillery shells and cluster munitions to be used by the Ukrainians in the war. Why did they send them this? Well, there's a few reasons. The first reason is they just don't have enough traditional military shells at the moment to make up for the amount of ammunition that the Ukrainians are using every day. And so the American government has made the argument that even though cluster munitions aren't the most humanitarian weapons, at the end of the day, they need a transitionary weapon until they get enough artillery production at home in like Pennsylvania, weapons manufacturers, in order to make up the difference so that they'll have a sustainable supply line for the Ukrainians. So basically, these are transitionary weapons, but there's also a strategic weapon. The cluster munitions that are being sent over, we'll just focus on one. The one that's being sent over, I forget its exact classification, but it has 72 bomblets when it is dropped. This DCIB, I forget the exact abbreviation, very sorry. But it has 72 bomblets, and it covers a width of like multiple football fields. And so when you're thinking about these entrenched, okay, it's DPICMs, thank you. When you're thinking of these entrenched Russian positions in Zaporozhye, with the minefields and the trenches and the armored vehicles and all of this stuff, these weapons were made almost explicitly for stuff like that. They could clear out trench lines after trench line, turning Russian positions into Swiss cheese. And since the Ukrainians, and we're going to talk about this later on today's show, Ukrainians have seemed to have changed their tactic in how they're fighting in Zaporozhye. At first, they tried to punch through the line. They made some progress, but not a lot. I think at the end of the day, they've made like 5 miles of progress, which is something, but they need to make like 60 miles of progress. And so after that punch, and they took some high casualties, equipment losses were like one of the big things. We got a report recently that about 20% equipment losses. They have decided to change tactics and now bombard the Russian positions, try to whittle the Russian positions down, try to soften them up, and then strike. And that's not to say they weren't softening them up before, but they're intensifying that process. They're intensifying that softening up. That's the easiest way I could describe it. And these cluster munitions are perfect for that type of job, because you can't really use them in heavily dense populated areas like a city because of how destructive they are and they're widespread, they're not accurate. But in these trench lines, they're a lot bit more effective. So I can, of course, I've already said on my other segment, I've aired my humanitarian concerns about the amount of unexploded bomblets that could be left behind. While these have a less of a dud rate than the Russian munitions being used, it's still of a concern. Definitely for someone like me who has lived a month with demining crews in Kharkiv and filmed with them and saw and met the guys directly and drank with the guys who are going to be the ones to disable these mines at the end of the day. But putting that entire discussion aside for a moment, they may retaliate if Ukraine uses them. So what this article basically amounts to saying is Vladimir Putin putting forward the idea that, man, if Ukraine uses cluster munitions, we might use cluster munitions. And if they're not careful, if they start to use cluster munitions in this war, and we do know that the cluster munitions have already arrived in Ukraine because we had some of our stockpiles already pre-positioned in Europe, or if war was ever to break out. If they're to use these cluster munitions, the Russians will use cluster munitions and they won't hold back. Let's read a little bit. Russia has a stockpile of cluster munitions and will consider using them against Ukraine if they are used against us, President Vladimir Putin said. Putin's comments come just days after Ukraine received a delivery of American-made cluster munitions, though a top military official told CNN they have not yet been used. Russia has a sufficient... Oh, by the way, there was another question at one point to, I think, a Ukrainian official, like, hey, when are you going to use these cluster munitions? And they said, we'll let the Russians figure that out. Basically, you'll know because they'll start being fired at the Russians. Putin's comments come just days after Ukraine received a delivery... Oh, I already read that. Russia has a sufficient supply of various types of cluster munitions, the Russian leader said during an interview with a pro-Kremlin journalist. If they are used against us, we reserve the right to mirror actions. So, when I read this headline, I don't have usually like a visible reaction to a story. You know, usually when I'm reading an article, I'm very stone-faced, just trying to absorb information. But when I read this headline, and it was with Reuters, the Reuters headline was even worse. Can we actually look up Reuters cluster munitions? I just want to show you guys the headline so you know where I was in my head's not returns. Cluster munitions, Reuters. Putin says Russia will use cluster munitions in Ukraine if it has to. I think they actually had a different headline, but it was along the lines of Russia will use cluster munitions if Ukraine uses them. Russia has been using cluster munitions since the first days of the invasion. Let me just show you two examples from the same city. We won't even branch outside of the city I'm currently residing in. I'm currently residing in Kharkiv. So let's stay in Kharkiv. Here's one video. This is from a year ago.
Are amassing in the eastern part of the country, the Ukrainian military bracing for a large-scale attack. This is video that we are now seeing. This is new video that's showing explosions from cluster munitions. You see that there very clearly. This is happening in a civilian area in the Kharkiv region. I want to go live now to Kyiv and bring in CNN's Frederick Pleitgen. Fred, what is the latest?
Actually, let me look at what was that on the ground there?
Pleitgen.
Was that like a
kind
of looked like a butterfly mine? I'm sorry. I just wanted to see that. What is that? I can't tell. It's impossible to tell.
Kyiv region. I want to go live now to Kyiv and bring in CNN's Frederick Pleitgen. Fred, what is the latest?
Hi there, Brianna. Well, here in Kiev, the situation continues to actually ease up. You can see behind me that I'm standing in central Kiev right now. We don't have to wear flak vest anymore.
Okay, we don't. This is the early days of the war. How early is this? This is April. Well, let me give you another example. If you're like, okay, that's not enough evidence, Dylan. That's one video, okay? What? Do you have more evidence? Yes, I do. Same city, too.
I can see another way to escape, so we have to do this.
But no escape today in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. Military experts say it looks like Russia is using cluster bombs, which are banned by many countries.
This is a residential area with no military objects.
Here, a factory of some kind, now destroyed. It was a relentless bombardment.
Those are also cluster munitions, by the way.
Of a major city as peace talks were beginning.
Oh, and this is like clips of like Ukrainians saying, screw off Russian soldier. But you get the point. The Russians have been using cluster munitions in this war for quite a while now, since the very first days of the war. And this is what's so frustrating about the cluster munitions conversation. There's a real conversation about, you know, if we're going to send these weapons, we need to increase the amount of demining equipment we're giving them. Did you know we've only fulfilled 15% of the demining equipment requests that the Ukrainian government has made? 15%. And you know, after being with the deminers personally for so long, no, they don't have enough heavy demining vehicles. They don't have enough drones. They don't have enough trainers. There's so many shortages of so much stuff that deminers have to go out of their way and fundraise for their own stuff, fundraise for their own equipment personally, sometimes take money out of their own pocket, out of the low pay that they get, and put it towards demining equipment, both military sappers and CESU emergency worker sappers as well. Emergency workers deminers. I don't think the technical word is sapper because they don't plant bombs. They're only demining. CESU deminers. CESU is the emergency services. Incredible shortages in equipment. And there's a real discussion about increasing the amount of shipments that we give. I know Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, in a recent, I think it was a CNN interview, he said that they were going to increase, but they need to get near to 100%. We should be at numbers like 80%, 85%, 90%. Not only because that equipment is going to be vital for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, because I don't know if you guys have been reading any of the reports, but the main problem that the Ukrainian military is running into is minefields. It's one of the biggest obstacles they're running into, is that the Russians have put so many mines out there. And after visiting these farms, you can find some farms in Kharkiv that were liberated where there's like 150 anti-tank mines in a single field. And so this is an area in Zaporozhye that they've built up over a year, and they've built miles upon miles upon miles of mines that need to be destroyed. So it's important for the military aspect. If we give Ukrainians armored vehicles and F-16s and all this stuff, but we don't give them the proper equipment to get rid of the minefields, then they're not properly equipped for this counteroffensive. And so they're having to send sappers into incredibly dangerous positions with low amounts of equipment in order to demine these areas, when they should have better equipment. They should have demining equipment that could do it from a distance. They should have so much more to throw into this fight. But it's not only because of the military applications that this is important, it's also important because of the humanitarian implications, which I think are pretty obvious. Unexploded mine, kill civilians. I found anti-tank mines with demining crews mere like 100 feet from civilian homes that are actively being lived in. Butterfly mines, which are anti-personnel mines that are extremely brutal. They're designed to maim and injure people. It can blow off your arm. They are easily mistaken as toys, as they were a lot in Afghanistan, which killed a lot of Afghan children and permanently maimed and injured a lot of Afghan children. We've seen those 20 feet from homes that civilians are actively living in, as in like they're right next to the road. Right next to the road. 20 feet from somebody's front door. So this is a very big issue. But what's frustrating about the demining conversation, but specifically the cluster munitions conversation right now, is it seems the entire world just found out that cluster munitions are being used in the war. And it's not because they just found out of what the Russians have been doing for the last year and a half, and they're not using it in military positions, but in just civilian housing in Kharkiv. They've only tuned into this conversation once the Americans gave the Ukrainians cluster munitions to use in the military positions in Zaporozhye. And so I'm frustrated because it feels like people only care when the Ukrainians use cluster munitions, and no one cared ever when the Russians were using it for the last year and a half. Nobody cared. That's what's really frustrating to me. These when I look up cluster munitions now, when I was trying to search for like Russia cluster munitions, look how many words I had to put. Russia uses cluster munitions, Ukraine video. Usually I could, you would assume I could just put Russia cluster munitions, but if I do Russia cluster bombs, you know what comes up now? If I put up Russia cluster bombs, Putin says Russia ready to use significant stockpiles of cluster bombs. Russia has cluster bombs, might use them, Putin says. Vladimir Putin threatens to use cluster bombs in Ukraine. Russia vows retaliation as cluster bombs arrive in Ukraine. They've been using them the entire war, but all these headlines are Russia might use them, Russia might have them, Russia might throw them at the Ukraine. They've been using them since day one. This is not a change in policy. They've been doing this since the first day of the war. And now if you look it up, you don't get videos of them doing it. You get videos of interviews that make it sound like they haven't done it. And that's the thing that's so frustrating about this conversation to me. God, it's unbelievably frustrating.